All right, so now we're moving into the final section of this unit, which I know has been really long. So this is the last little bit, and this is the first era of reform in the United States, the first time that we're going to see a large number of people trying to make a lot of changes in society and law and sort of the way our whole culture operates to make it all better. So it really all starts out as a religious revival. This is actually going to be the second Great Awakening. Remember the first Great Awakening we talked about from the 1730s was with, remember, the preachers George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, and we read the sermons from them, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So the Second Great Awakening is actually going to be quite different. It's going to be largely Protestant like the first one, but it's not going to be so much about, the covenant of grace versus the covenant of works and that entire thing. This is going to be more about doing God's work and using your religious beliefs to make the world around you a better place. So this guy right here with the super crazy beard is Charles Grandison Finney, and he was sort of the main preacher during the Second Great Awakening. And he primarily preached in the area you see on the map there. That's the state of New York. That red part is what we call the burned over district. And it was called the burned over district because it was sort of burned up with the fires of like spirituality and stuff. That's sort of the nickname they had because that was a very sort of religious part, and that was sort of where the center of the Second Great Awakening is. So Charles Grandison Finney is a very different type of preacher from George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. Remember I told you the two of them were a lot more low-key. Charles Grandison Finney is very charismatic, sort of a big personality type of person. I know his picture doesn't really look like he is, but that's the reputation that he had. And, thousands of people will come from all over the country just to hear him speak. And he would speak about living well and working hard. Like I said, wanting to do God's work. So the Second Great Awakening sort of brings all these people back to Christianity, and now that they have sort of rededicated their lives to their faith, they're going to want to do what Finney is talking about and do God's work, and that's going to start this whole reform movement. So the Second Great Awakening is the cause of the first reform era. So the temperance movement is going to be one of the first ones, and temperance is referring to alcohol. So this isn't prohibition. They're not. It's not necessarily about outlawing alcohol, although some people in the temperance movement do want that. This is more about moderation. They said that alcohol, and they're correct, is linked to sickness and poverty and the hardship of families, and it was mostly women who were involved in the temperance movement a lot of time because women were sort of the ones who were directly impacted by the negative parts of alcohol abuse. There was this idea of a man was supposed to take care of his family, and if he was an alcoholic, then he couldn't do that because, they would be poor because he would spend all his money on booze, and he would be sick and violent and be his wife and not take care of his children, not be able to have a job, all of that. So a woman was sort of considered to be the victim of a lot of the consequences from someone being an alcoholic. So a lot of women are going to be involved in the temperance movement. You see these women here, this sign that says, "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours." So we're also going to see a big reform movement in education. You see these two guys here, Horace Mann and William McGuffey. I think McGuffey's name appears to be cut off a little bit at the bottom, but you should have him written down on your graphic organizer, William McGuffey. So we're going to see a big change in education and a new push for a change in curriculum. We're going to see the first common schools. Common schools are actually public schools. They're just called common schools. And they're called common schools. You can remember that because they're sort of like for the common people. These are really the first large amount of common schools, public schools that we're going to see, and they're for people who can't afford private schools. Now, the quality of them is very low, so we're going to see a lot of people wanting to reform that. We're going to also see groups of people called Friends of Education, and a lot of them are Quakers. Remember, I've told you before that the Quakers also are called Friends. So they want to extend and improve public schools, and one of those guys is Horace Mann. So in 1837, Horace Mann became the first Secretary of Education in the state of Massachusetts, and he wants to make a lot of changes, including he thinks that states should fund and supervise schools like we know they do today. That's something he wanted. He also wanted attendance to be compulsory. What does compulsory mean? It means mandatory. So he thinks that children should have to go to school. He advocated for more teacher training. There wasn't really a lot of teacher colleges or education programs out there in higher education in the United States. And in 1839, he opens what we call the first normal school. A normal school is a school to educate teachers. So a common school is a public school. A normal school is a school for teachers. In 1852, he also passes the first compulsory attendance law, so requiring students in Massachusetts to go to school. So by 1860, 6 out of every 10 white children were attending school, which is a very big increase from the number that we had seen before that. This guy on the right, William McGuffey, actually really creates our first textbook on sort of reading and writing for children. They were called eclectic readers, Eclectic, eclectic readers. They taught reading and morals and intellectual values. He sells 100 million copies, so these are going to become very popular. So this nice lady right here, her name is Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix actually originally got involved in the education movement. She was doing a lot of education reform, and while she was doing that sort of path took her to prisons, and she was reading to prisoners and to the mentally ill. And when she was doing that in Boston, she actually owned her own school in Boston by the time she was 19. When she was doing this, she saw the conditions that prisoners and the mentally ill were kept in prisons back in the 1800s, and it was sort of appalling. Back then, we had no separate facilities for people who were mentally ill versus people who were violent criminals. They were all kept in the same place and treated really, really horribly. The conditions were awful. So she started advocating for more humane conditions for prisoners and the mentally ill. And thanks to Dorothea Dix's work, by 1843, she manages to officially petition the Massachusetts state legislature to fix the problem. So they start working on prison reform and reform for the mentally ill. By the time she dies, there are over 100 different facilities in the United States to care for the mentally ill, professional treatment centers that are separate from just prisons for violent criminals, which is an incredible thing. So usually whenever you hear her name, it's always associated with the mentally ill. So there's a lot of professional treatment centers for mental illness that are named after her. So Transcendentalism, I know that's a very big word. It sounds sort of intimidating, but Transcendentalists were essentially the world's first hippies. Transcendentalism is the belief that knowledge is found not only in the observation of the world, but also through reason, intuition, and personal spiritual experiences. So basically, these people were all about, learning doesn't just come from a book and from seeing things. It comes from inside. It comes from using your gut and your mind and, having real experiences with yourself and nature and more hands-on learning. So they really supported social reform. So these two guys right here are both very famous authors and transcendentalists. We'll talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson first. So on the left, you see Ralph Waldo Emerson. He really wrote that people should be self-reliant and trust their own intuition. He also wrote a lot about nature, and you see what I was saying about them being hippies. He wrote a lot about nature and how people, humans and nature, were all connected in some way, and he ends up becoming one of the world's most renowned American authors. On the right, we've got Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau wrote more about the relationship between humans and law, and he said that people should act according to their own beliefs, even if that belief breaks the law. Now, he didn't mean like if you believe that murder is morally right, you should do it, even if it breaks the law. He meant If there's something that you believe is morally right that the law hasn't caught up with yet, then you should still do that. He read a book called Civil Disobedience, and that idea is actually going to influence a lot of people. Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, people like that are going to read Thoreau's work and writing about civil disobedience and take that into their own lives and practices. And he wrote in that the government is best when the government is least, basically meaning we need small governments because big governments tend to be corrupt. And he actually he really put a lot of his arguments into practice in his own life. Henry David Thoreau actually ends up being arrested because he doesn't pay his taxes, and he doesn't pay his taxes because he doesn't agree with slavery. And he said that slavery is morally wrong, and so I'm not going to pay money to a government that supports slavery. So that ends up coming back to put him in jail. But it wasn't something that he just sort of talked about. He practiced civil disobedience as well. So Transcendentalism ends up sort of taking us on this path to eventually utopianism. So if you've heard the word utopia before, a utopia is a perfect society. So a lot of Transcendentalists believe that a utopia is possible, creating a new community sort of free of any social problems. So a couple of people in the early 1800s tried to make this into a reality. Robert Owen, you see here, as one of them. In 1825, Robert Owen founds this blueprint you see here on my right called New Harmony, which New Harmony is in Indiana, and it was meant to be a new utopianistic society. And unfortunately, utopia is not possible, right? Because humans are imperfect, and so their societies are inevitably going to be imperfect. And people living in New Harmony couldn't put all of Robert Owen's rules and everything quite into practice, so it fell in about 3 years. In 1841, we see a community called Brook Farm established in Massachusetts, also meant to be a utopia. They emphasized equality a lot, but just like I said, it fails in 1847, just about 6 years later, because they had this huge debt. They weren't able to sort of balance all of their budgets with what they were looking for. Now, we do see one community that ends up sort of not necessarily being a utopia, but sort of the most successful type of community like this, and they're called the Shakers. The Shakers are actually a sect of Quakers. So this is a Christian sect founded in the 1700s, and by the time we get to this time, the 1830s and on, there are over 6,000 people living in Shaker communities around the country, and there are some even Shakers around today. So now let's talk about immigration. So we're going to see a huge influx of immigration here when we get into the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And so what is spurring that immigration but two things? And that's called the push-pull model of immigration. So pushes are factors that cause people to leave their homeland. So things that happen in your home country that are bad that make you want to leave. So you see a list right here on this diagram. Poor health care, violence, natural disasters, bad economy, religious persecution, things like that are all things that would make you want to leave your country and move to another place. So that is something that causes immigration. And the other thing that causes immigration is a pull factor, something that's so wonderful about another country that it pulls you in. So religious freedom, a better economy, free education, no war or battles are going on, social anarchy or anything like that happening. So things like that. So we're going to see a lot of things pushing people out of their home countries in the 1830s. But we're also going to see a lot of things happening in the United States that are going to be pulling people here. That reform movement is really going to start pulling people to the United States.